She didn't look like the type you'd kill for, Royer thought as he took mental notes of the scene. He watched as the husband patted her back. He looked up at Royer with a mix of bewilderment and anger. "Officer, you sure?" the husband asked yet again. "Detective Royer, and yes, we do have the suspect's confession," he responded. The kitchen still smelled of burned rice. The news must have been distracting. Royer looked at the wife again, wondering what it was about this plump, average-looking woman that had prompted a man to murder. She raised her face to look at him for the first time, and he caught his breath. Those eyes, moist, pure liquid amber, fringed with long lashes, stared into his, as though he was the last man on earth. Those eyes told him that he, and he alone, could save her, that with her very being, she believed in him. His assistant, Officer Charles, said something, and Royer swallowed. "What?" he asked and cleared his throat. The wife lowered her head into her hands again and sobbed. Royer was grateful. He didn't know if he would have had the strength to look away otherwise. "I said we've completed the search of the premises, sir," Officer Charles said and frowned at him. "Are you okay?" "Yes. Okay, wrap it up. Mr. Green, I will have to ask your wife some questions," Royer said, but instead he began searching his coat pockets for a cigarette. His hands were shaking. He excused himself and went onto the front porch and lit up. What was that, he pondered, and tried to assess his unexpected visceral reaction to Mrs. Green. He stared up at the turquoise sky, dotted with puffy clouds, wandering lazily across the expanse. It was an exceptionally beautiful, sunny day. He imagined the beaches must be crowded with teens on summer vacation. It was not a day to deal with corpses and obsessed killers. Mrs. Green was pretty, but those remarkable eyes, they looked into a man's soul. Royer's forehead creased as his analytical mind took over. Here you had a neighbor, a bachelor of middle years, looking after a mother with dementia, living next to the Greens. Darren Samuel was an English literature teacher, short, bald, and overweight. Never married, although there had been one serious relationship in his late 20s. You take a man like that, with nothing exciting happening in his life, and put him to live next to Mrs. Green. Royer felt a lurch in his stomach as he suddenly realized, as a confirmed paunchy bachelor of 52, he had a lot in common with Samuel. How would I fare with those eyes staring at me every day? She looked at me with such yearning and yet with such innocence. In that moment I wanted to do whatever it took to make her happy. He reflected on this glumly. If Mrs. Green had stared at Samuel like that every day for the 2 years they had been neighbors, Samuel would have had no choice but to go insane. A woman shouldn't be able to look at a man like that. Royer petulantly dropped the cigarette onto the porch floor and ground it in with his shoe. He took a deep breath to clear his head and went back into the house. The Greens were still sitting at the kitchen table, but Mrs. Green had composed herself now. She glanced up at Royer, and her eyes begged him to save her. He frowned at her ferociously, but his heartbeat quickened. "Mrs. Green, Mr. Samuel gave his mother an overdose of pills which killed her. He claims you asked him to do it." Royer began cautiously. He looked at Mr. Green, trying to concentrate. She protested, as of course she must. She would never do anything like that. She was a Christian woman, and she was only going over to visit Mr. Samuel, who was bedridden and lonely. Royer found, if he listened to her voice and avoided her gaze, his brain was less addled. He almost sighed with relief. Her voice was sharp, with a bit of city accent to try to hide the deep country origin. He looked at Mr. Green, who was staring at his wife with complete adoration. He glanced at Officer Charles, who was scratching at her weave and taking notes in turn. He looked over at the other officer who had completed the search of the house. The young man's mouth was partially opened, and he was staring at Mrs. Green. "Detective, you must believe me," she burst out, and startled, he automatically looked at her. "I'm drowning. I'll do whatever you want. Just love me," Royer's thoughts tumbled chaotically. Mrs. Green gave a tremulous smile and lowered the lush curtain of her lashes over her gaze. His cell phone rang, a harsh bell tone that broke the silence. Royer's mouth was dry. Officer Charles stood with her pen poised and raised her eyebrows at him. The young officer to her right blinked and swallowed. It's men. Only us men who are affected, Royer thought. He grabbed the phone and answered it. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Mrs. Green's bowed head. He put the caller on hold and then looked at Mr. Green to be safe. Darren Samuel has committed suicide in the holding cell. He left a note, Royer said. Mr. Green looked horrified and he hugged his wife, who had begun weeping anew. He left his house and apparently some land his mother owned to you, Mrs. Green. Royer made his voice hard and suspicious. She protested. The husband protested. It made no difference, of course. She now owned a home larger than the one they were renting, and a premium plot of land. Royer signaled to his officers and they left the Greens. Officer Charles was shaking her head as she reached the patrol car. Sir, you think they had a plan, Mrs. Green and Samuel? You think there was an affair? Charles mused, her voice heavy with doubt. No, I think he thought there was going to be an affair. I'm sure he saw what he wanted in her eyes, Royer said. Charles gave a short laugh. So she'd tell him to kill his mother with her eyes then? Royer settled behind the car wheel and started the ignition. If I could, I would charge her with manslaughter, he said grimly and drove off.